Most people assume surnames are a fairly recent invention, something Europe adopted a few hundred years ago, mostly to make tax collection easier for whichever king needed the paperwork. That assumption falls apart the moment you look at Ireland. While most of Europe was still identifying people by a single first name and maybe their fathers, Irish families had already locked in permanent inherited surnames, names still carried by living people today. Some of these names appear in written records from before England had even been unified into one kingdom, let alone started using surnames of its own. These aren't reconstructed guesses. They're documented, dated, and still walking around in phone books and passport offices right now. Today, we're counting down 15 of the oldest Irish surnames still in active use. And if yours is on this list, you're carrying a piece of identity older than most of the countries currently telling you what your own history is. Before we get into it, my ebook breaks down the full history and meaning behind hundreds of Irish surnames in far more depth than one video allows. It's linked in the description. Subscribe if this is your first time here, and once your surname shows up on this list, drop it in the comments. I read every one of them. Surname 15. O'Grady. O'Grady traces back to the Dalcassian dynasty of Munster, the same royal line that produced Brian Boru, and the name is believed to have been fixed hereditarily not long after his reign in the early 11th century. The O'Gradys held territory in County Clare for generations, positioned closely enough to the ruling O'Brien dynasty that their history is deeply intertwined with one of Ireland's most consequential royal bloodlines from the very start. Unlike many Gaelic families who lost everything during the later plantations and land confiscations of the 1600s, several O'Grady branches managed to retain portions of their ancestral land well into the modern era by converting early to the Protestant faith and cooperating with the New English administrative system, a controversial survival strategy that split opinion within the wider Gaelic community at the time, but kept the family name attached to real property for centuries longer than most of their neighbors. Surname 14. McMahon. McMahon literally means son of the bear, a name that emerged from the ruling family of Oriel in what's now County Monaghan, with records placing the surname in active hereditary use by at least the 12th century. The McMahons held power in the region for roughly 400 years afterward, and the sheer aggression baked into the name's meaning wasn't just poetic. It reflected a dynasty that had to fight continuously to hold territory wedged between larger, more powerful neighboring kingdoms. The clan's power only truly broke during the 9 Years' War at the close of the 16th century, when English forces deliberately targeted Ulster's ruling families. But McMahon descendants scattered rather than disappeared, and the name remains one of the more common surnames across the wider Ulster region to this day. Surname 13. Moriarty. Moriarty comes from Kerry, meaning roughly navigator or sea-skilled one, and the family operated for centuries as a seafaring, coastal-based sept under the wider overlordship of the O'Sullivan dynasty. Records place Moriarty as an established hereditary name by the 12th century, tied to a stretch of coastline where survival depended as much on reading tides and currents as it did on holding land. Because the Moriartys operated as a subordinate sept rather than an independent ruling dynasty, historical records of them are sparser than for the more dominant O'Sullivans, but local tradition and surviving place names across the Dingle Peninsula still mark out the stretches of coastline once specifically associated with Moriarty control. Surname 12. Phelan /Whelan. Phelan descends from the ruling family of the Des territory in what's now County Waterford, a dynasty whose name appears in the Irish annals as a fixed surname as early as the 10th century, making it one of the earlier confirmed examples of hereditary naming in the country. The Des kingdom itself predates most of the better-known Irish kingdoms in the historical record, giving this name a genuinely deep root. Even after the ruling family's political power faded following Norman incursion into Waterford in the late 1100s, the Phelan and Whelan names spread widely across the southeast, becoming one of the more common surnames in Waterford, Kilkenny, and Tipperary today, proof that a name can easily outlast the kingdom it was born to rule. Surname 11. O'Dwyn, Dunne. Dunne, meaning brown or dark-complexioned, traces to a ruling family based in County Lough, chieftains of the territory known historically as Uí Riagain. The name was fixed by at least the 11th century, and the Dunne family maintained local chieftain status stubbornly for centuries afterward, holding on to power in their home territory long after larger, more famous dynasties around them had been broken apart by outside conquest. Part of that endurance came from the difficult, boggy terrain of Lough itself, which made large-scale military occupation genuinely difficult for outside forces, giving the Dunnes a natural defensive advantage that better documented dynasties on open ground simply didn't have. Surname 10. Daly, Daly. Daly is unusual on this list because it isn't a warrior or royal name. It's a name built around intellect. The Daly family were hereditary poets, the highest tier of the professional bardic class in Gaelic Ireland, a position that carried enormous social respect and required years of formal training in complex poetic forms. Their surname was fixed by at least the 12th century, and members of the family served as court poets to multiple ruling dynasties across Ireland, meaning the Daly name owes its survival not to holding land by force, but to being too valuable as trained cultural memory keepers for ruling families to do without. Bardic poetry in this era wasn't casual entertainment. It required over a decade of formal training to master the strict metrical rules involved, and a skilled poet from a family like the Daly line could make or ruin a king's public reputation through verse, giving them a strange kind of protected status even amid constant political violence around them. Quick pause. If your name's shown up yet, tap that like button. It helps this reach more people hunting down their own family history. Back to the countdown. Quick reminder, full territory maps, meanings, and ancestral occupations for names like these are all sitting in the ebook linked below. Surname 9, O'Malley. O'Malley comes from a seafaring clan based along the Mayo coastline, controlling Clew Bay and the surrounding waters as their own maritime territory for centuries. Historical mentions of the family as a fixed hereditary name go back to at least the 11th century, and the clan built its power on control of shipping and trade routes rather than farmland, a maritime dominance that would later produce the legendary 16th century pirate queen, Grace O'Malley, who negotiated directly with Elizabeth I as an equal. Surname 8. O'Flaherty. O'Flaherty comes from West Connaught, a name that translates roughly to bright ruler or prince, and it belonged to a clan so persistently aggressive in defending their territory that the merchant families of nearby Galway City built actual defensive gates specifically to keep them out, with one surviving inscription reportedly begging protection from the fury of the O'Flahertys. Records place the name in hereditary use by at least the 11th century, tied to one of the most militarily uncompromising clans in the west of Ireland. Surname 7. O'Rourke. O'Rourke descends from the ruling dynasty of Brifin, a territory spanning parts of modern Leitrim and Cavan, with the surname fixed hereditarily by at least the early 11th century. One O'Rourke king, Tiernan O'Rourke, is infamous in Irish history for a personal feud that indirectly triggered the Norman invasion of Ireland in 1169, after a rival king abducted his wife, and O'Rourke's retaliation set off a chain of alliances that changed the country's entire trajectory. Surname 6. O'Dwybgin, Devine. Devine descends from a Donegal-based sept whose name is recorded in hereditary use from around the 11th century onward, tied to territory in the northwest that saw repeated contact with both Viking settlement and later English plantation efforts. The family maintained a persistent local presence despite centuries of outside pressure on the region, and the Devine name survived the Ulster plantation of the early 1600s, one of the most aggressive land redistribution efforts in Irish history, which displaced huge numbers of native Ulster families in favor of English and Scottish settlers, in far greater numbers than many neighboring Gaelic surnames managed to. Surname 5. O'Chilly, Kelly. Kelly is the most common surname of purely Gaelic origin still in use today, descending from the ruling family of the Uí Main territory spanning parts of Galway and Roscommon. The name was fixed hereditarily by at least the 10th century, making it not just old, but extraordinarily successful at spreading centuries of political alliance, marriage, and simple population growth turned one dynasty's name into one carried by hundreds of thousands of people worldwide today. What's less commonly known is that the Uí Main territory the Kellys ruled functioned as a genuinely sophisticated regional power for centuries, maintaining its own distinct legal and ecclesiastical structures even while larger, more famous kingdoms around it rose and collapsed, which may be part of why the name proved so durable in the first place. Surname 4. McCarthy. McCarthy descends from the ruling kings of Desmond in Munster, with the surname fixed in hereditary use by the 12th century, following the fragmentation of the larger Munster kingdom after the death of the last High King of a unified Munster. The McCarthys went on to rule portions of Munster independently for centuries longer than most Irish dynasties managed to hold power after the initial waves of Norman invasion, in part by playing rival Norman and later English factions against one another, rather than confronting any single outside force directly. That careful balancing act let branches of the McCarthy family retain real regional authority in parts of Cork and Kerry all the way into the 1600s, centuries after most other Gaelic ruling houses had already lost any meaningful independent power. Surname 3. O'Connor. O'Connor descends from the kings of Connaught, a dynasty that produced the very last High King of Ireland, Redri Ua Conchobair, whose reign ended with the Norman invasion in the late 12th century. The surname itself was already in hereditary use before that point, meaning this family's name predates the political collapse that it would later become historically associated with. Ruaidhri's reign is often treated as a symbolic endpoint for independent Gaelic Ireland, but the O'Connor name itself carried on regardless, with multiple branches of the family continuing to hold regional influence across Connaught for generations after the High Kingship itself had become a purely historical title with no real power attached to it. Surname 2. O'Brien. O'Brien descends directly from Brian Boru, the High King of Ireland, who died at the Battle of Clontarf in 1014, defeating a Viking-allied coalition, arguably the single most consequential battle in early Irish history. The surname was adopted by his direct descendants shortly afterward, and the O'Brien dynasty went on to rule Munster in various forms for centuries, making this one of the most historically documented royal surnames anywhere in Ireland. Later, O'Brien descendants took strikingly different paths through history. Some branches led continued resistance against English rule for generations, while others, including one direct descendant who later became Earl of Thomond, formally accepted English titles under the Tudor-era policy of surrender and re-grant, trading old Gaelic kingship for a recognized English peerage in order to keep at least some ancestral land within the family. Surname 1. O'Clery /Clark. O'Clery is frequently cited as one of the oldest recorded hereditary surnames, not just in Ireland, but in all of Europe, with mentions in the Irish annals dating back to the early 10th century, generations before most of the continent had adopted anything resembling a fixed family name system. The family later became renowned as hereditary historians and scholars, most famously producing the compilers of the Annals of the Four Masters in the 17th century. Meaning the very family credited with one of Europe's oldest surnames also became responsible for preserving much of Ireland's early written history for everyone else. That's 15 surnames, some of them older than most European nations currently sitting on a map. If your name made the list, comment below and let me know where it landed. If it didn't, the ebook in the description covers plenty more. Subscribe for next week's deep dive into another hidden piece of Irish ancestry. See you in the next one.